Today I will be ranking the albums by Forbidden. They are a thrash band that I feel could have been Big Four worthy. They're one of those thrash bands that arrived a little late to the game. Or in other words, they were part of that second wave of Bay Area thrash bands that came out around the same time as bands like Testament or Death Angel. They only released 5 albums, and I will be doing this in the traditional worst to best format. First, a little history. You might be interested to know that the band was formed by drummer Jim Pittman and guitarist Rob Flynn. And yes, it is the same Rob Flynn of Machine Head. The original name was Forbidden Evil, but they shortened it to Forbidden. You might also be interested in knowing that Paul Bostaph was in the band before joining Slayer. They released 2 thrash albums in the late 80s and early 90s. Then they went into a groove metal direction in the 90s, and they took a long break, and they released a comeback album in 2010. So I will be talking about all of those, but now let me get on with the ranking. Coming in number 5 is Green. That was released on March 21st, 1997 through the Gun Records label. The problem with this album was that they completely abandoned their sound from their first 2 albums and tried to adapt to the changing times by going into more of this groove metal direction. They did this on the previous album as well, and I'll talk about that soon. But on this album, they went too far. It's hard to even label this album. Some call it post-thrash, others call it thrash/groove. I even read someone calling it groove metal/half-thrash. Another big issue with this album is that their vocalist Russ Anderson had completely changed his vocal style, which was very distinct on the first 2 albums. The previous albums had more of that falsetto singing, and this one is him trying to be Phil Anselmo. The guitar riffs are also very different. They sounded like types of riffs you would hear on a typical Pantera or Machine Head album. There was this industrial sound that a lot of metal bands were trying to do during those times. And in addition, songs were much slower and more groove-oriented. There were a few standout tracks, such as the title track Green, which was very reminiscent of the aforementioned Machine Head. There was a track called Fat, or P-H-A-T, which retained a little bit of that original thrash metal sound. Song lyrics also address themes like political oppression and disliking the government. But on a positive note, there were a few semi-decent tracks, such as Over the Middle, that was very up-tempo and had some awesome drumming. Although the lyrics were kind of weird, they were about a football game, so that was kind of strange. But overall, this is considered their worst album, and it comes in last. Coming in number 4 is Distortion. This was released on November 30th, 1994. This is the album where they started to move more into a groove metal direction, but I still think it's better than the previous album, Green, that I just talked about. The album was also released 4 years after the previous album, which is called Twisted into Four. This was also released on the Gun Records label. A lot of things I said about the album Green also applied here, but to a lesser degree. For example, the tracks are significantly slower than they were in the previous albums. The guitar riffs also sound like groove metal. The vocal style is a little different, but there are some melodic moments on a few of the tracks. So, for example, Feed the Hand and Mind's Eye had vocals that can be compared to 90s thrash. One standout is a cover of King Crimson's 21st Century Schizoid Man, which sounds like a very slow and sludgy cover of it, which I thought was pretty good. I know a lot of other metal bands have covered the song because this particular song translates very well into metal, so I thought it was pretty decent. There are also a few songs like Hypnotized to the Rhythm, Wake Up, All That Is, and a word that starts with R that I can't say on YouTube, and they all retained some elements of thrash metal. So I think this album is not very bad. It's a slight departure from the first 2 albums, but I think it's worth listening to. And actually I think it's much better than the Green album, which I really didn't like at all. I just want to take a minute to say I have memberships on my channel. The first tier is 99 cents. It gives you early access to my videos. I always post them members first before going public, sometimes up to a week in advance. The second tier is $2.99. It gives you early access plus the benefit of making video requests. You can request album reviews or any other video provided it is within the scope of the channel's content. There is a link in the pinned comment as well as in the description, so please join. Coming in number 3 is Omega Wave. This is their comeback album that was released in 2010. This is after a 13-year absence. The album was released on October 22nd, 2010, and has 2 new band members who are Steve Smith on guitar and Mark Hernandez on drums. This is also the last Forbidden album with Russ Anderson, and also the last album that they released. However, I read they have another album planned, which might come out this year, but I haven't really heard anything in that regard. This album is a return to thrash metal roots. I thought it was a little bit similar to their 90s groove metal period as well, but mostly thrash. I think they're experimenting a little bit on this one just to add a little bit of variety. The album is basically a combination of the first two albums, which obviously are going to be 1 and 2 in this ranking, but they also still try to leave a few elements that connect this album to their Distortion album. I think the best way to describe this album is that it's a melodic thrash metal album. There's a little bit of experimentation. So for example, there's a song called Swine, which had a little bit of a psychedelic rock influence. The album features more tremolo pick guitar riffs and double bass drumming, probably due to the influence of the new members. It's also a really good sounding album, possibly the best production out of any of their albums. Russ Anderson is going back to his original vocal style that he used in the first two albums, although it can't really hit the same highs as before, but despite that, his vocals are still very strong. There's one song I liked a lot called Dragging My Casket. It's the type of song people will either love it or hate it. It's them trying to write a Black Album type of song. It's very melodic, mostly clean vocals, but I liked it. I thought it stood out. If I have anything negative to say, is that some of the tracks towards the end of the album were a little longer than it should have been, so that maybe makes the album drag a little, but it's not too much of an issue. Overall, it's a very good comeback, considering this band had been inactive for about 13 years. This leaves the first two albums for numbers 1 and 2. First album was called Forbidden Evil. It was released on September 30th, 1988 through Combat and later Relativity. Twisted Into Form was released on March 30th, 1990 on the same labels. Twisted Into Form is also celebrating 35 years, by the way. So let's talk about the two albums. Forbidden Evil was their debut. It has Paul Bostaph on drums, and Rob Flynn co-wrote 3 of the songs, but he didn't perform on any of them. The opening track, Chalice of Blood, is a killer track, has some technical guitar playing, really shows off what this band could do. Then there's a song, Off the Edge. It's a fun track because throughout the song, Russ Anderson sings a line like, I'm on the edge. And then you hear the other members in the background, they're saying, jump, jump. You hear that in the background. Then at the end of the song, it sounds like the person jumped off the ledge because you hear Russ Anderson do the scream as he's falling off the edge. And he's like, ah. It's an awesome song. You got to hear it. But the lyrics on this album were typical for thrash bands these days. They sang about things like religion and paranormal activity. And I think this album was just as good as anything the Big Four were doing at the time, in addition to the other Bay Area thrash bands like Testament and Exodus. This album had a very good lineup as well. The album had the guitar duo of Greg Luciero and Greg Alveus, and they worked very well together. There was also the drumming of Paul Bostaph, and you'll notice that he has his own style that was very different than he's playing on the Slayer albums. The only negative is that Max Camacho's bass is sometimes low in the mix, but otherwise it's a great debut. Let's talk about Twisted Into Form. I bought this album back in the day after watching the music video for Step by Step on Headbangers Ball. There was one lineup change with Tim Calvert replacing Greg Alveus on guitar. It's also the last album with drummer Paul Bostaph before he joined Slayer in 1992. The album was released just in time in terms of thrash metal because it was right before both grunge and the Black Album. So in other words, thrash bands had this window for releasing albums that were on their own terms. I would even go as far as to say that 1990 was one of the best years for thrash. This album is characterized by more complex and intricate riff work, and it relied less on lead guitars compared to the debut. Russ Anderson has some of the best vocals on his album. I would even say he perfected his vocal delivery on this album. It was like a cross between the heavy metal vocals of someone like Steve Grimmett of Grim Reaper and the raspiness of someone like Steve Zetro from Exodus. The album also had a great production value. There were some good tracks, like the opening instrumental called Infinite, goes into Parting of the Ways. Out of Body, Out of Mind was very memorable and had some awesome vocals. R.I.P. is a thrasher, one of the better deep cuts. I still like the single Step by Step. And I like One Foot in Hell. It's kind of a darker song, but possibly my favorite on the album. Overall, it's a great album. So my ranking is going to be Forbidden Evil at number 2 and Twisted Into Form at number 1. Let me know how you would rank these albums in the comments section. In the meantime, check out this ranking of the band Testament. I thought it would be a good video to watch next. And thanks for watching. Please give the video a like. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe if you're not already. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.